What ocean creature are you most scared of? Is it great white sharks? Or maybe anglerfishes creep you out? For me, it's the mighty Kraken. And today, I'm building a diorama of a Kraken attacking a merchant ship. Cue the intro. What's good, mini crafters? A while back, I snagged this model ship from a hobby store, and I didn't really have a project in mind when I bought it. But after watching Pirates of the Caribbean Dead Man's Chest, I decided that I wanted to make a little scene of a Kraken attacking this ship on open waters. It came with pretty extensive instructions of just 2 steps, pretty much showing a fully assembled model, and I said what every cocky husband says when their wife brings home something from IKEA. Pfft, I don't need the instructions. I started by snipping off the ship pieces from the sprues. From there, I started to glue all of the non-sail parts together to make the body of the ship. The model comes with a little stand and a nameplate, but I won't be needing them. The only identifier on the box says Cuddy Sark, but I feel like we can do better than that. If you think of a better name than Cuddy Sark, drop it in the comments below. Once I had the ship glued together, I started snipping the sails from their sprues. And at first, I thought all the sails were individual pieces that I would need to either glue or tie together. But thankfully, this model is historically realistic, and each of the sails are fused together into one gigantic piece. With the 3 main sails cut off the sprues, I glued all of those to the 3 masts of the ship. They're smaller individual triangle sails that are going to go in between and around the 3 main ones, but I'm going to add those after I get the Jacob's ladders in place. Hold up, who the heck is Jacob, and why are we naming ladders after him? Like, what did he do to earn such a prestigious honor? Either way, the ladders are easy enough to add as they each have some extra length of plastic on the tips so that I can cut them to the right size for a nice connection. I thought adding the ladders prior to the smaller triangle sails would make my life easier. After getting the ladders in place, I popped these little square sails on the back 2 masts. I see then in the instructions that they want me to tie smaller triangle sails in place with some small thin thread. That doesn't really sound that fun, but I guess we'll do it. Turns out it wasn't fun. It was actually pretty hard to tie little knots, but making sure that the threads were in the right length for each sail was even trickier. To save you the pain of watching me do each of these sails, I'm going to use some movie magic to jump ahead like 2 hours that it took me to do this. Here's what it looks like after getting all the sails threaded. I actually think it looks pretty good when all of the threaded sails are in place. And now that I've spent a good amount of time making the ship look so good, it's time to destroy the whole thing. That's right, I'm going to essentially break this ship in half. Why? Because while I've never personally been in a Kraken attack, if you have, please comment below, I can't imagine that it's a pretty event. I plan to have a number of giant tentacles wrapped around and trying to pull this ship down to its watery grave. I first use my rotary tool and with a disc cutter attached, and I roughly slice the ship into 2 pieces using that. I'm planning to have one of the Kraken's huge tentacles draped through the middle as though it's just slammed it down, breaking the great ship into 2 splintered pieces. Speaking of splintered pieces, I'm next taking a variety of balsa wood planks and I'm breaking those in half and gluing them into different bits and pieces on both halves of the ships so that it looks like the ship was cracked in half by this Kraken rather than by me with a rotary tool. After all the debris is done and the ship is completed, I'm moving on to make the Kraken itself. For the Kraken, I'm only making the tentacles since the beast itself will be below the ship trying to drag it down. I'm going to be using Sculpey oven baked clay for this part, but I'll hedge how bad this may turn out by saying that I've never really done any sculpting work like this before. I mean, come on, it can't be that hard, right? I have 2 ways that I'm going to be making these tentacles, but I don't know which one I need to either do again in the future or neither of them. Bottom line, let me know down in the comments below which of these 2 options look better in your opinion. The first way is to use tinfoil as a sort of armature to layer the clay on top of. I start by crushing and shaping the foil into the tentacle shape that I want. Some will be extending up out of the water, while others will be coiled up around the ship. I know at some point I want to shape a tentacle that will be slammed down across the center of the ship where I cracked it in half. As I layer clay across the foil and smooth it out to cover the foil, I'm worried that it's looking a little bit too lumpy. I also worry that it may be slightly too big to fit the scale of the diorama. On the other hand, Krakens do have a lot of tentacles, some of which I'm sure are thicker than others. For the suckers, I'm taking little balls of clay and I'm using a ball end tool to make a tiny cup of sorts. I then use the ball end tool and press that cup into the tentacle to look like a sucker. I'm going to be doing this all the way up each of the tentacles. The second way that I'm going to be making the tentacles is by simply rolling out a snake shape of the clay without a tinfoil core. This gets me a much more uniform shape and looks a lot smoother. Adding the individual suckers to each of the tentacles sucked, but I think the end result turned out looking great. And because of that, I actually decided not to use the thinner, non-foiled tentacles, but I'm not really sure if that was the right move. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, and while you're down there, if you haven't subscribed already, consider doing so. Once I have all the tentacles made, I simply pop them in the oven to cure, and afterward they're ready to prime up. It's super easy, and you don't need a 7,000 degree kiln to do this. If you want to pick up some of the clay that I used here for yourself, I'll have a link for that in the description below. With the ship done and now having made the tentacles, I take everything outside to prime it all up for painting. Now normally, you would use an airbrush to make short work of this painting, but guess who doesn't have an airbrush? But you know what? We don't need an airbrush. Airbrushes are for chumps. I'm breaking out this thick brush and I'm base coating the ship in a few key colors. I'm going to be using Vallejo's flat brown for the lower half of the hull, and I mixed up a darker navy color for the upper half of the hull. For the sails, I'm base coating those in an off-white color, and once dry, I'm hitting it with another layer of white. And then another layer. And then another layer. And another layer. For the details on the ship, I'm going to be using a smattering of different metallic colors for the metal pieces, white for some of the woodwork, and making sure that I hit all of the prime parts up and get this ship done. With the ship all painted up, it's time to move on to the Kraken. I'll admit, I wasn't sure how I was going to paint the tentacles. Normally, you'd break out an airbrush, but without one, and with the brushwork taking so long on the ship, I ended up turning to the sponge. I used some normal acrylic paint from Master's Touch, nothing fancy like I would use for painting miniatures, and I dabbed and stippled the tentacles with a base coat of a dark brown-green mixture. The color not only blended naturally because of the sponge, but the sponge actually left behind a subtle texture on each of the tentacles. This is exactly the look that I was after, since I felt that the tentacles looked too smooth when I initially made them. Just be sure that you don't add water to your paint if you're using this sponge. Otherwise, the texture won't be there, and rather the paint will spread out and smooth out. For the suckers, I switched from the sponge to a large brush, and I applied a base coat of a dark titanium white with a hint of pale pink mixed in. The brush allows for better control, as I don't want to get any of that lighter color on the dark green-brown tentacle skin. Lastly, I come in with some Pro Acryl's Tan Flesh to help fill in any patchy areas on the suckers and to give it a bit of a skin color as well. With all the painting done, I can now move on from that to making the sea base itself. Let's crack on. Get it? Because Kraken. I need a base for all of this to sit on, and rather than just get a plank of wood or use foam alone, I'm going to be using this frame that I found. Oh, Carol, you're so bad. Now you might be thinking that I'm going to be using resin for this part, but actually I'm not going to be using any resin at all. Rather, the trick is going to be done with tinfoil. I'll explain in a moment. First, I cut a piece of foam to fit the frame, and then I cut a divot into the foam so that the ship is nestled into the water and won't look like it's sitting on top of the water. I then use my hobby knife and my fingers to get rid of the excess material as I dig it out. Once I know where the ship will be, I'm going to be doing the same thing for each of the tentacles. I space them out around the ship and I cut little holes and divots for them to sit in. I then take a butane torch, and while wearing a respirator, I create some natural looking wave patterns. You definitely want to open a window, have a fan going, and or wear a respirator because this will put off some fumes. For the areas around where the tentacles will be, I do some radial waves as if it's just burst forth from the ocean. After torching everything, I take some tinfoil and I create some little waves and ripples moving away from each of the spots where the tentacles are. I glue down each ripple with some hot glue and keep it in place for the next step. With the surface textured how I want, I take a bigger sheet of tinfoil and I wrap the foam in that, being sure to leave wrinkles as I go. I work and push the foil into all the cracks, waves, divots, holes, and crevices, but I do smooth out any sharp edges that I come across. Once the foil is in place, I break out some Mod Podge and I apply that all over the foil for two reasons. First, it's going to seal everything up and protect the foil and the foam. But secondly, it's going to act as a primer for the coming paint job. You're probably thinking, damn Samuel, that is a pretty clever way of making convincing water. But you really think that my smooth brain came up with this whole idea on my own? Wrong. I stole the idea from Scale-A-Ton, who is an incredible diorama builder and a scale modeler. As a responsible content and hobby creator, I will of course be giving him credit. I'm going to have his channel linked down below in my description, so be sure to check him out for some helpful tips and cool projects. Again, I don't have an airbrush, but that's not going to stop me from making some convincing looking seawater. I'm base coating the whole thing in a flat white to start, but then I'm going to be coming in with a nice sea green that I mixed up using a phthalocyanine blue and green. I apply my sea green to nearly the entire surface, but I'm making sure to leave the peaks of my waves lighter. I'm using a sponge again, and I'm going to be blotting the color all over and going back and forth into the recessed waves after they've dried again to darken them further while leaving the peaks lighter. After that, I mix up a darker steel blue color and I mix that with a glaze medium. I'm applying that to the whole surface, and the glaze medium is going to help make this more transparent. This time, I'm focusing it in the lower depths and parts of the waves to help convey depth of the ocean. I'm not really worried if my water looks a little bit spotty here because the next step is really going to be unifying everything. The final step is to apply a layer of gloss Mod Podge as a final coat. This is going to seal everything together, and it's going to tie together the ocean surface to make it look like real glistening water. Once that's dry, I'm gluing the ship in place. Now, you can see here it doesn't fit perfectly as I've added layers, moved the foam, I've also built up a texture, all of that since fitting it. But a really cool way to fix this and hide the gap is to actually use cotton balls. I pull the cotton balls apart and I'm going to stuff them down into the gap between the ship and the base. I'm then taking some AK Interactive Seafoam. I'm going to be kind of using that as a glue to hold the cotton in place, but also start to build up the appearance of seafoam around the ship. I do the same technique for each of the tentacles, first gluing them into their place, and then using the cotton and seafoam to blend them into the scene. The last step with the seafoam and for the whole build is to use the AK Interactive Seafoam to add foam to all the crests and the high points of the waves all across the surface of the sea. It's a subtle touch that I really think helps pull everything together. I then paint the sides of the base black, and we have a Kraken attack. This was a super fun build to do, and if you enjoyed the video and you want to help support the channel, there are a couple of things that you can do to help. First, you can like and share this video with your hobby friends if you think they would enjoy it. Second, you can subscribe to the channel if you haven't already and you enjoyed this content. And third, I have affiliate links down in the description below, which you can use if you're looking to pick up some of the supplies or products or tools that I use, such as the ship or the clay. Those cost nothing to you, and it gives a little kickback to the channel to help support me and keep this all going. That's going to do it for this one, you guys. Until next time, keep on crafting.